There was a moment, one single, suspended moment, when Bill Goldberg was the most unstoppable force professional wrestling had ever seen. Not the most technically gifted, not the most polished performer in the locker room, but the most feared, the most electric, the kind of presence that made 70,000 people rise to their feet before he had even taken a step toward the ring. Just the sound of his music cutting through the arena, just the sight of that entrance, the smoke rising, the sparks falling, the silhouette of a man who looked like he had been built for exactly this. That was enough. That was everything. He went 173 matches without a single loss. 173. In a business built entirely on scripted outcomes and carefully managed stories. That streak felt like something different from everything around it. Something that couldn't quite be explained by the normal rules. It gave him a mythological weight, a kind of gravity that very few performers in the entire history of that industry have ever been able to carry. And then it ended. Not just the streak. Something deeper than that. Something in the very direction of a career that had been moving like a freight train suddenly, quietly shifted, and the full story of how that happened and what it ultimately cost him is far more complicated and far more human than most people ever had the chance to understand. Because the public version of Bill Goldberg's fall was always kept simple. The man got beat. The man lost his momentum. The man came back too many times and eventually faded into the background, like so many others before him. That was the easy version, the one that fit neatly into a sentence. But the real version, the one underneath, involves injury and politics and broken trust, and a psychological weight that no championship belt, no matter how prestigious, could ever fix or replace or make right. This is that version. To understand what really happened to Bill Goldberg, you first have to understand what he actually was. Not the character. The character is easy to describe. Shaved head, powerhouse frame, a spear that came out of nowhere, and a jackhammer that ended matches in under 3 minutes flat. The character was a force of nature wrapped in beautiful simplicity. And that simplicity, as counterintuitive as it sounds, was the very source of his power. Audiences didn't need to think about Bill Goldberg. They just felt him. But the man behind the character was something considerably more complicated. He was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1966. He grew up with sports woven into the fabric of who he was. His father was a musician, but athletics became Goldberg's native language almost from the beginning. He played football with real, documented ability, moving through high school and into the University of Georgia, where he developed into a defensive tackle good enough to draw professional attention. He was drafted by the Los Angeles Rams in 1990. He played for the Sacramento Gold Miners in the Canadian Football League. He had a stint with the Atlanta Falcons that carried genuine promise. Football was supposed to be the whole story, the beginning, middle, and end of it. But injuries, the quiet, accumulating kind that never make headlines, but slowly and methodically dismantle a career. From the inside, redirected everything. By the mid-90s, the path forward in football had narrowed to the point of closing, and Goldberg, at the suggestion of people around him who had made similar transitions out of athletic careers, began exploring professional wrestling. To most outsiders, the idea seemed almost impossible to take seriously. Wrestling was a performance art, a scripted spectacle, everything that his identity as a legitimate athlete had been conditioned to reject. The predetermined finishes, the theatrical emotion, the carefully choreographed conflict, and yet something fit. Something about the raw physicality, the crowd energy, the sheer unfiltered experience of standing in front of thousands of people and demanding their complete attention. Something clicked in a way that genuinely surprised him. He signed with World Championship Wrestling, WCW. In 1997, his technical skill was rough by the standards of the industry. His ability on the microphone was still developing. His in-ring vocabulary was limited compared to men who had trained for a decade. But none of that seemed to matter, because from the very first moment he stepped through the curtain, the audience responded to him in a way they simply did not respond to almost anyone else. There was an authenticity to his aggression that people could feel in their chest. It wasn't manufactured in a creative meeting or coached out of him by a trainer. It came from somewhere real and specific, from years of genuine athletic discipline, from the slow frustration of a football career that had been taken away before he was ready to let it go, from a competitive hunger that had no other outlet left. It made him a star with a speed that surprised everyone involved, including the people who signed him. By 1998, his undefeated streak had become the defining narrative of WCW. The number climbed week after week. The crowds grew louder. The chants filled arenas with a kind of collective electricity that was almost impossible to manufacture intentionally. And for one blazing, remarkable, unrepeatable stretch of time, Bill Goldberg was the single most talked about name in professional wrestling anywhere in the world. Then the machinery of the industry slowly, quietly began working against him. The streak was never supposed to become what it became. In its earliest form, it was simply a booking decision, a standard technique for building a new talent quickly by giving him consecutive victories and letting the momentum do the narrative work. WCW had used variations of this approach before, but something happened with Goldberg that nobody in the building had truly anticipated. The audience didn't just accept the streak as part of the show. They invested in it emotionally. They began tracking the numbers on their own. They began treating each match not as entertainment to be consumed and forgotten, but as a ritual, something that felt, in the deeply particular emotional logic of professional wrestling fandom, genuinely meaningful and worth protecting. And that created a problem that nobody in WCW's creative structure was fully equipped to solve. When something becomes that valuable, the question of what to do with it becomes almost paralyzing. An undefeated streak cannot last forever. The internal mathematics of storytelling simply won't allow it. Eventually, the invincible man has to fall. But the longer that fall was delayed, the higher the stakes of the ending became. The person chosen to end the streak would need to be exactly the right person, in exactly the right moment, executed in a way that honored everything the story had built. That is not what happened. What happened instead was a decision driven not by creative vision or long-term planning, but by competitive panic. WCW in late 1998 was locked in an escalating war with the WWF, a ratings battle that had consumed the entire industry for 2 years and was beginning, for the first time, to tilt visibly in the WWF's favor. The pressure inside WCW's decision-making rooms was immense and daily, and under that pressure, the choice was made to end the streak, in a way that observers, both at the time and for years afterward, have consistently described as short-sighted and wasteful of. Everything that had been built, Goldberg's undefeated run ended on December 27, 1998, not in a clean, dramatic match with a story built patiently over months, not in a moment that felt like the natural culmination of everything the streak had come to represent. It ended with outside interference, a taser, and a finish that left many in the audience feeling something closer to deflation than catharsis. For Goldberg, the experience was never simply a storyline development to be processed and moved past. According to accounts from people who were close to him during that period, he had serious concerns about how the entire situation was handled. From the management of the streak to the execution of its ending, he had invested something genuinely personal in what that streak represented. It had become, quietly and completely, tied to his identity in a way that went far beyond the professional. It was connected to who he understood himself to be. And when it ended the way it did, something shifted inside the story of his career. Not visibly, not loudly, but underneath the surface of a career that was still moving forward by every external measure. A quiet and significant fracture had formed. Professional wrestling is not kind to the human body. That is a fact the industry spent decades minimizing, and that the athletes inside it spent decades absorbing in silence. The schedule is relentless in a way that is difficult to fully communicate to people outside it. The physical demands are disguised as performance, but executed with real force against real tissue and real bone, week after week, city after city, with almost no room for recovery. And for someone like Goldberg, whose entire identity inside the ring was built on explosive, full-speed physicality with absolutely nothing held back, the cumulative cost was always going to arrive. The only question was when it arrived faster than anyone expected. The injuries that built up during his WCW run were not minor inconveniences to be managed around. His style demanded total physical commitment on every single performance, without exception. There was no lower gear available. There was no version of a Goldberg match where he eased through the physical demands. To protect himself for the next night, every spear, every jackhammer, every full-speed sprint down the entrance ramp was executed at the kind of intensity that leaves. What happened to Bill Goldberg in the years between his 2004 departure and his eventual return in 2016 is a chapter of his story that almost never receives the attention it deserves. The public narrative has a habit of skipping over it entirely, jumping directly from the WrestleMania XX moment to the 2016 comeback, treating the 12 years in between as though they were simply a gap, an intermission, a pause before the next act began. But those years were not a gap. They were a period of deep and genuine personal reckoning for a man who had organized his entire sense of self around athletic achievement, around physical dominance, around the specific identity of being the person in any room that nobody could stop. When that identity no longer had an arena to perform inside, the work of figuring out who he was without it became real and daily, and not always comfortable. He pursued other projects. He worked in film and television with varying degrees of engagement. He discovered, or perhaps rediscovered, a genuine passion for cars that had existed long before wrestling, and that offered something the sport never quite had: work he could do alone, with his hands, without a crowd and without a score. He married. He became a father to a son named Gage, who gradually became the clearest and most honest answer to the question of what everything was actually. But identity forged over. Decades of physical competition doesn't dissolve cleanly just because the competition ends. The psychological residue of being the most feared man in your industry, and then no longer occupying that position, and having to construct something new in its place, is something that athletes across every sport have struggled to describe, and struggled even more to actually navigate. The language for it barely exists. The roadmap doesn't exist at all. According to interviews Goldberg gave during this period, the transition required more from him than he had anticipated. He spoke honestly, at various points, about the particular strangeness of being recognized everywhere he went as a version of himself that existed in the past, of being defined by a streak, by a moment, by an era that had already closed. He acknowledged, in the careful and measured way that public figures tend to acknowledge difficult things, that the discipline required to build a life after the spotlight was genuinely different from, and in some ways harder, than the discipline required to perform inside it. The physical realities of his career didn't simply stop because he had stepped away from the ring. The body doesn't offer clean endings. The accumulated cost of years of full contact athletic performance, first in professional football, then in the uniquely demanding physical environment of professional wrestling, was a debt that continued to be paid in small and large ways, regardless of whether he was still competing. The ledger stayed open. It kept its own time. What he found in those years, slowly and imperfectly, was something quieter than anything he had known at the height of his career, something that couldn't be built quickly, couldn't be rushed by momentum, and didn't come with a crowd to confirm that it was real. Whether that quieter life was enough, whether it genuinely filled the space that the career had hollowed out, is something only he has ever been in a position to honestly answer. When Goldberg returned to WWE in 2016, the building's reaction said everything that needed to be said about what the audience had been carrying in his absence. He appeared unannounced at a live event, and the noise that followed was not polite recognition or nostalgic warmth. It was something more immediate and more visceral than that. It was the sound of a connection that had never actually broken, that had simply been waiting, through 12 years of silence, for the chance to express itself again. He was 49 years old. What followed was a stretch of high-profile matches that, by any reasonable measure of what should have been physically possible for a man of his age and accumulated history, should not have happened the way they did. A victory over Brock Lesnar at Survivor Series 2016 that stunned the audience with its brevity and its impact. a Universal Championship win, WrestleMania appearances, moments that generated the kind of genuine attention and financial return that confirmed his value to the company was not simply sentimental, but woven into that return and into the subsequent returns that followed. Because Goldberg came back more than once, were moments that revealed something deeper and more complicated than simple athletic resilience. A match against The Undertaker in Saudi Arabia that did not go the way anyone had planned. An injury that was serious, that was real, and that Goldberg chose to speak about publicly with a directness and a lack of defensiveness that separated him from the way professional wrestling typically processes its most difficult moments. He did not disappear behind a carefully managed statement. He did not allow the company's narrative machine to smooth over what had happened. He addressed it directly, honestly, and with the specific vulnerability of a man who had spent his entire career being defined by the absence of vulnerability. He acknowledged, plainly, that the person he had been at 31 and the person he was at 53 were separated by a gap that was real and meaningful, and that the effort to close that gap, even partially, even for the duration of a single match, came with consequences he had to live with afterward. That honesty was, in its quiet way, more significant than the streak had ever been, because the streak was always a story about invincibility. What the honesty was about was something more rare and more human than that. It was about the willingness to stand in front of the same audience that had once chanted your name across an undefeated run of 173 matches and say, without flinching, that it had not gone as intended, that there were limits, that the man and the myth were not the same thing, and never had been. And it was that willingness, that specific and hard-won kind of transparency, that ultimately made his story something more than a wrestling story. There is a question that settles quietly at the end of any story like this one. Not a factual question, not one with a clean and documentable answer, but a human question that stays with you after the facts have been accounted for. What does it actually cost a person to be that extraordinary at something, for that sustained a period of time, and then have to gradually, imperfectly figure out who they are once it's over? Bill Goldberg's story is not a tragedy in any classical sense of the word. He is alive. He has a family he speaks about with a warmth and a specificity that makes clear. It is the most important thing in his life, by a distance. He has a legacy that remains, in large parts of the wrestling world, not just remembered but genuinely revered. The streak exists in the permanent record. The moments exist in the memory of everyone who was in those buildings when they happened. But there's something in his story, something that doesn't fit neatly into either the hero narrative or the cautionary tale, that carries the particular texture of a life lived at an intensity level that the ordinary world isn't built to accommodate. He was made by genetics and circumstance and the particular alchemy of athletic talent, meeting personal hunger for a specific kind of arena. And arenas eventually go dark. What endures past that darkness tends to be quieter. The son he talks about with more obvious love than he ever spoke about any championship. The authentic work of staying connected to an audience that, for reasons neither side could fully explain, simply never let him go. The honesty that came later in his career, earned through difficulty, not performed for an audience, about what the experience had actually been like from the inside. Professional wrestling has always had a strong institutional appetite for mythology. It smooths over the complicated parts. It packages careers into clean narratives with obvious arcs and satisfying conclusions. It prefers the legend to the full truth. Goldberg's story persistently resists that packaging. It is uneven and marked by moments that don't resolve cleanly, by decisions, some of them his, some of them made by people above him in rooms he wasn't invited into, that left visible marks on a career that had begun with such extraordinary, seemingly inexhaustible momentum. And yet, the image that persists for most of the people who watch him across any part of his career is not WrestleMania XX. It is not Saudi Arabia. It is that entrance, the smoke curling upward, the sparks cascading down, the spear that ended matches before they had time to develop into anything complicated, the chance from a crowd that had made a collective and unrequested decision, that this man was something they had never seen before and might never see again. They were right, and the full story of what happened to that extraordinary thing, how it was handled and mishandled, how it survived and eroded, how the man at the center of it tried to carry it with dignity, even when the circumstances around him made that genuinely difficult, is a story that deserves to be known completely, because it says something honest and lasting about what happens when exceptional human ability collides with the ordinary fragility underneath it. And it reminds us, gently and without fanfare, that behind every streak and every entrance and every thunderous arena chant, there's simply a person doing their best to figure out who they are and what they're supposed to do next, and whether any of it was worth what it cost. If Goldberg's story landed with you today, whether you were there for the streak in real time or you're encountering it now for